everyone, I'm Justice Pirate. I'm going to tell you my minimalist story. I guess the best place to start is the very beginning. I grew up in the same house for many, many, many years. We never moved. My room was the smallest room in the house and it was really, really tiny. We could barely fit a bed and a desk in it, but I had to do my best with all my stuff. And I had a lot. I was very into calling myself a material girl based off of Madonna's hit song. I loved fashion. I loved decorating my room with stuff all over the walls. But at the same time, I was a little bit of a neat freak, but it was hard to keep my little room tidy. But I remember waking up in the middle of the night sometimes when I was only like 6 years old and just cleaning out my closet and cleaning the room to make it spotless because it just felt better. Over time, I built up what were called memory boxes. I had two really vacuum-sized boxes that I kept in my closet. These memory boxes were filled with little things that I valued. I was very sentimental at the time, which I'm not anymore, but I was. Because when I was a kid, I didn't really have a lot of friends, so I would like to keep souvenirs about those friendships or things that signified them. And sometimes I would even go over people's houses and ask them for a souvenir, which was terrible of me, but that's what I did. However, my simple living started really young. I was very interested in the idea of people that lived in little shacks in the pioneer days. I remember going to field trips in my state where there were these small houses and I loved it. I even had my dad build me a house when I was about 8 to 10. It took him a few years, but it was a little shack where I wanted to spend my summers with my dog, and I had a bed in there and it was going to be great. But unfortunately, there were issues where I couldn't actually stay in it and it became a shed. I have a pretty big gap between my brothers and I, so therefore I felt kind of alone most of the time. I couldn't really go places. Everyone dominated the TV, so I was in my room a lot. Therefore, I had to find things that kept me occupied and it made me creative. For many summers, I would go to camp for like a week to a month, depending on the year. While I was there, we would just live in these big tents without electricity. I lived out of a suitcase that whole time. And I also was one of the people that just loved to clean the tent, loved to keep things very tidy. When it came to bathrooms at the camp, they would call me over to help with certain things because I loved to clean. So even though a lot of this stuff doesn't really tell my minimalist story yet, I really feel these were the building blocks for what made me a minimalist later. One of my camp friends actually started to live out of a suitcase on a normal basis, and she would just drive her car. And eventually she built her own cabin with her husband, and it was off-grid. It was the first time I ever heard of that because that was probably in 2005. She would tell me all about it. I found it very fascinating. I would even tell her things like, I don't know how you do it, but that sounds really fun. I always loved the idea of living out of a van, like one of those minibuses. I even had posters on my wall for minibuses. I loved the idea of a hippie lifestyle where you just travel the world, go surfing. Stuff like that really inspired me. I got engaged when I was only a teenager. And by the time I was 19, I was like, okay, I'm gonna be living soon with my future husband. Therefore, I need to maybe get rid of some of this stuff that I've piled onto these memory boxes forever. And you know what? When I got rid of, I literally emptied out those boxes completely. I threw out things and it surprised my mom to see me do it. And I said, I don't need this stuff. And I felt so free. I felt really good. When we got married, we lived in my parents' basement, so it was also pretty small, much bigger than the room that I grew up in, but it was small for two people to bring their combined items into. But I tried my best to keep it neat, but it was very difficult to do. Our money situation was not good. We were spending our paychecks. We were sometimes paying bills when we should have always paid our bills, and it got us to go under in our bank account often. It was really dangerous. We just didn't know what we were doing. We were young. We finally got our first apartment about a year and a half after getting married. And while there, it took only 2 months for me to get pregnant. Pregnancy changed my whole perspective about what I owned. I started to think to myself, I am responsible for this child. I need to not have so much stuff. What am I doing with myself? This is not a good environment for this child to grow up in if I have just collection upon collection of junk. That's when I started to realize I don't need this. I don't need this. I don't need this. So I started selling them on eBay and making money to provide for my future baby. I became a little bit too into it. I was very passionate. It got to the point where all my clothes just fit in this box that I kept in the closet, while my husband had like a 4-drawer dresser to himself. I kept telling my husband, can I sell this thing? Can I get rid of this? He's like, no, that's mine. I don't want you to get rid of it. I just was so liberated. I needed to get rid of everything. It just felt so good. This was in 2006 that I started to do this. The word minimalism was not even my vocabulary at all. I never heard of the word. It was just my lifestyle started to completely shift. I started to care about how I spent my money, where it was going to. I was starting to pay off debts. And we didn't really have much money, but I tried to find a way to make things work. I think around 2010, my husband started to get a little more interested in minimalism. He had something kind of holding him back. Something shifted in him completely, where he's like, I'm ready, let's get rid of this stuff. And I was like, yes! It made things so much easier to have him on board, because then I could have the life that I really wanted, but I respected him enough to not push that on him. So I started selling even more stuff, and it was so freeing. We even documented it for a while. We had our own podcast. On top of it, I was being more conscious about where I was getting my things, because I was working for a nonprofit fighting human trafficking. Simple living became heightened for me. I started to make my own cleaning products. I started to use a cup instead of having pads and tampons. All the clothes that I bought, I was very careful where they came from down the supply chain. It's just like everything changed about my mindset in that moment once my husband was on board. Since then, I still love being a minimalist and just being able to declutter on a regular basis. I love living simply and having a slower pace of life. It's fun. Although I understand it's not for everyone, I love when people start to ask me questions or say like, hey, I'm kind of interested in this. Can you tell me more? I think what it comes down to is my sentiment is all in my brain rather than more of a needing a material possession to remember something. It's just easier to let things go these days than it ever has been. Anyway, that's like the shortened story of my very long minimalist journey. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope you have a wonderful week.